I have heard a good many stories about the way a single afternoon can rewrite a marriage before it has properly started. Most of them are gentler than this one. This one is about a threshing machine, a wheat harvest, and a woman who fixed both in the same long Dakota afternoon, while her husband stood at the barn door and watched his certainty come apart one bolt at a time. Garrison Wick had a threshing machine in his barn that had beaten 3 experienced men across 2 consecutive harvest seasons, and he had just watched the woman who arrived that same morning as his mail-order bride walk straight past the farmhouse door, set her sing-sole traveling bag down beside the fence post, and ask, with the flat practicality of someone who had not traveled 400 miles to make small talk, what was wrong with it. Her name was Nell Ashby. She had come from Dayton, Ohio, on the strength of a matrimonial advertisement Garrison had placed in a farming circular the previous winter, describing himself as a Dakota Territory wheat farmer of steady habits seeking a capable partner for homestead life. Nell had answered the advertisement with a letter that described herself as handy with tools, practical about hardship, and not given to complaint. Garrison had read the letter with the particular skepticism of a man who had spent 2 seasons watching capable people fail at the one task his livelihood depends on, and had learned that capable was a word people applied to themselves with considerably more generosity than reality usually supported. He had also spent those 2 seasons developing a very specific and deeply felt opinion about the threshing machine, sitting at the back of his barn like a reproach. The machine was a German-made cylinder thresher he had purchased second-hand 3 years earlier, from a neighbor who was giving up on Dakota altogether. And for the first season it had run well enough. In the second season, somewhere in the second week of the wheat harvest, it had developed a grinding irregular fault that no amount of adjustment seemed to correct. A sound like a stone caught in gearing, intermittent enough that it took a careful ear to identify, and stubborn enough that 3 men with considerably more mechanical experience than Garrison possessed had failed entirely to isolate its source. The first man who tried was the blacksmith from the next township over, a confident and competent man named Birch, who had declared within the first 20 minutes that the drive belt was the problem, and replaced it at Garrison's expense with a heavier one that lasted exactly 4 days before the grinding returned. The second was a machinery agent passing through on his circuit who had spent an afternoon with the machine and concluded that the cylinder bearings were worn and needed repacking. A repair that cost Garrison more than the belt, and solved precisely nothing. The third was his neighbor's hired hand, a taciturn German immigrant named Scheer, who knew machinery and knew his limits, and who told Garrison after 2 honest hours that whatever was wrong with that thresher was beyond what he could find without the manufacturer's specifications, which neither of them had. Garrison had started the current harvest season with a rented machine from the Wilson Brothers 3 Farm South, an arrangement that worked, but cost him a percentage of his yield, and the better part of his pride every time he drove his grain over to their place. He had also that same winter placed the matrimonial advertisement, partly because 42 years of homestead life had made him lonely in ways he did not particularly enjoy examining, and partly because a practical woman, as the advertisement specified, seemed more useful to a Dakota wheat farmer than any other kind. He had not, in the advertisement or in his own thinking, specified a woman who might know anything about machinery. That particular possibility had not occurred to him. It occurred to him now, watching Nell Ashby circle his broken thresher, with her hands clasped behind her back, and her head tilted slightly to one side, as though she were listening to something the machine was already saying before she had touched a single part of it. Garrison said, from the barn door where he had followed her, without quite deciding to, that the machine had beaten 3 men already, and that he had not expected to spend the first afternoon of his marriage discussing it. Nell said, without turning around, that she had not expected to arrive at her new home and find a threshing machine parked in the barn like a problem nobody wanted to solve, and that in her experience a problem left unaddressed did not become less of one, simply because everyone had agreed to stop looking at it. Garrison said nothing further. He leaned against the door frame and watched her continue her slow circuit of the machine, noting that she had not yet picked up a single tool from the shelf along the wall, had not attempted to open any of the access panels, had not done any of the things that Birch and the machinery agent and Scheer had done in the first 5 minutes of their own attempts. She simply looked, and occasionally stopped looking in order to listen, pressing one hand flat against the machine's iron casing in a spot she seemed to have chosen deliberately, her eyes closed, the September sun coming through the barn's side gap, and laying a stripe of light across the dirt floor between them. He did not yet understand that Nell Ashby had grown up in her uncle's machine repair shop in Dayton, spending the better part of her adolescence learning that a machine making noise it should not make was almost never wrong about what it was telling you, and that the surest way to misunderstand it was to decide, before you had listened long enough, that you already knew what the problem was. Her uncle had told her that every machine had a sound it made when it ran right, and a different sound for every way it could run wrong, and that a mechanic who went straight for the wrench before cataloging those sounds was a mechanic who would replace parts until he ran out of money or patience, whichever came first. She had also learned by the time she was 17 that the same principle applied with only slight modification to people. Her uncle had been a patient man. Her late father had not, and the contrast between the two had given her a very early and very clear understanding of what patience actually cost, and what it was worth when applied with care. Her own situation in Dayton had grown complicated in the years following her uncle's death. When the shop passed to a cousin who had no interest in her assistance, and a great deal of interest in telling her so, she had answered Garrison's advertisement, not because homestead life appealed to her in particular, but because a woman of 34 with a demonstrated gift for machinery repair and no shop to practice it in had a limited number of doors still open to her. And a Dakota wheat farmer who specified capable had seemed, at the time, like someone who might mean it. Here is the thing neither of them could see yet, standing in that same barn on that same September afternoon. Garrison Wick needed a great deal more than he understood. He needed someone who could prove a thing rather than simply state it. Having been burned twice in 2 seasons by men who had stated their competence firmly and then failed to demonstrate it, he needed, though he would not have said so, and would not have recognized it if someone had said it to him, to be wrong about something in a way that did not cost him further and that he could respect. Nell Ashby needed a man who would eventually watch her do the thing she was best at rather than ask her to put it away. She had not found that in Dayton, and she was not certain she would find it here, but she intended to find out before the afternoon was over. The thresher's harvest window, the period when the Wilson Brothers machine was available and the grain was dry enough to cut, closed at sundown. Garrison had mentioned this on the walk from the stage stop, in the tone of a man who considers context unnecessary but provides it anyway out of fairness. He had also said, with the flat humor of a man who does not expect to be taken up on an offer, that if she could fix the machine before the Wilson boys arrived at dusk, he would consider every word of her letter proven true. He had said it the way you say something you are certain will never be required of you. Nell had said only that she would need the afternoon undisturbed, and would prefer no one standing at the barn door offering opinions. Garrison had agreed to the first condition, and chosen to interpret the second one loosely. He watched her for the better part of the first hour from the door he had agreed not to stand at, and what he watched was, by every measure he recognized, nothing. She did not open the access panels, she did not touch the drive belt Birch had replaced. She walked around the machine and occasionally crouched beside it, her ear close to the casing, and once she lay flat on the dirt floor, to look at the underside of the cylinder housing, which none of the 3 previous men had done. She asked Garrison without looking at him, whether the machine had always made the grinding sound, or only after it had run for a while. Garrison said it started after about 20 minutes of running every time. Nell said nothing, but he noticed her nod once, a private confirmation of something she had apparently already suspected. His farmhand Odell, a quiet man of 50 who had been with Garrison for 7 years, and had watched all 3 previous mechanics attempt the machine without useful comment, came in from the field at mid-morning and stopped in the barn doorway beside Garrison. He watched Nell for a long time in silence. When he finally spoke, it was only to observe that she had been at it for nearly an hour, and had not yet picked up a wrench. Garrison said that was correct. Odell said that was different. He stayed. By the middle of the first hour, Nell had begun cleaning the machine in places that Garrison would not have thought to clean. Not the obvious outer surfaces, but the underside of the feeder housing, the channel around the main shaft, the gap between the cylinder and the concave where 2 seasons of chaff and grit had packed into a layer so dense it had effectively become part of the machine itself. She used a narrow brush she had produced from her traveling bag, which Garrison noted she had packed with tools alongside her clothing, and she worked without hurry, clearing the accumulation in sections and examining what she uncovered before moving on. The way someone examines a surface, they expect to find something on, rather than someone cleaning for the sake of cleanliness. Garrison said, from the door, that the machine did not need cleaning, it needed fixing. Nell said, without stopping, that in her experience those 2 things were rarely as separate as people preferred to believe. She said it pleasantly, the way a person says something they have had occasion to say before, and have learned to deliver without sharpness. The September light shifted across the barn floor as she worked. The smell of old chaff and dry wood and machine oil rose from the disturbed surfaces. Garrison found he had crossed his arms at some point and was not entirely sure when. The machine, once she had cleared the housing, revealed a component he could not immediately identify. A small paired wheel arrangement on the far side of the main shaft, recessed behind the cylinder housing in a position that required deliberate effort to see clearly. Garrison had never looked at it directly. None of the three men who had attempted the repair had directed his attention there. Nell crouched beside it for a long time, running one finger very slowly along the face of the smaller of the two wheels without quite touching it, her eyes moving between the component and some calculation she was making that he could not follow. Then she asked Garrison whether he had the machine's original purchase papers. He found them in the farmhouse and brought them back. Nell read the mechanical diagram on the back page of the bill of sale for several minutes, her finger tracing a section of the drawing slowly. Then she said quietly, the way a person says something they already knew but needed confirmed. There it is. What she had found was a worn cam follower, a small hardened steel component whose job was to translate the rotation of the main shaft into the motion of the grain separation mechanism. It was not a part any of the three previous men had examined, because it was not a part that showed wear the way a belt or a bearing showed wear. It showed its fault only after the machine had run long enough to warm the metal, at which point the slight gap that had developed in the worn face became wide enough to create the irregular, grinding contact that produced the sound Garrison had been living with for 2 full harvest seasons. She explained this to him in 3 sentences. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had paid 2 men to find that. Nell said they had looked for the most obvious answer first, and stopped looking when they found something that resembled it. She said it was a very common way to approach a problem. The fix required a shim, a thin piece of metal cut to specific dimensions that would restore the contact face to its correct tolerance. It was not a repair that required a machine shop or a parts order from a distant city. It required a piece of scrap steel of the right thickness, a file, and the patience to fit the shim correctly rather than quickly. Nell found the steel on the shelf along the barn wall, a strip left over from some earlier repair, and she spent 40 minutes at the workbench, cutting and fitting and checking against the component, setting the shim in place, and removing it twice before she was satisfied that it sat as it should. She worked with the focused stillness of a person entirely at home in a task, unhurried, checking each step before the next, talking to no one. Odell watched this from just inside the doorway and said nothing during the entire process, which for Odell was not unusual, but the quality of his silence had changed from its usual neutral character to something that Garrison, knowing the man 7 years, recognized as attention. Garrison himself had drifted without consciously deciding to, from the barn door to a position roughly 6 feet from the workbench. His arms had uncrossed at some point, he was not sure when. The Wilson brothers arrived early. They came across the field road in their wagon, and pulled up to the barn at a little past 4, intending to discuss the harvest arrangement for the evening run, and instead found themselves stopping short at the barn entrance and leaning against the wall, in the particular silence of men who have walked into something they did not expect. The older Wilson, Chadwick, had farmed the next section for 16 years, and had heard about the thresher's fault, the way a person hears anything in a township with few enough farms, that everyone knows everyone's trouble. He watched Garrison Wick's new wife reassemble a piece of machinery for a long stretch of time without speaking. When he finally did speak, it was to say that he had driven over expecting to haul Garrison's grain south the way he had for the past 2 seasons, and that he was not entirely certain what he was watching instead. Garrison said he was not entirely certain either. Nell closed the access panel and checked the drive belt tension, which was the last thing she examined before turning to Garrison and asking, in the same flat practical tone she had used all day, whether he was ready to run it. The machine started with the reluctance of a cold engine. It warmed through the first minute the way it always had, and through the second and into the third, and at the point in the 4th minute where the grinding had always begun. The point Garrison had come to recognize the way a man recognizes the particular sound that means something is wrong. The grinding did not begin. The machine ran, clean and even and without protest, the way it had run in that first season, before whatever had worn in it had worn enough to matter. And the sound of it running correctly filled the barn in a way that Garrison had not heard in 2 years, and had not understood he had missed until he was hearing it again. Chadwick Wilson said nothing for a moment. Then he said to his brother quietly that he needed a minute. His brother said he understood. Odell turned to Garrison and said, with the economy of a man who does not speak, unless he has something worth saying, that was that. Garrison said yes, that was that. He walked to where Nell stood beside the running machine and said, quietly enough that only she could hear over its noise, I doubted your letter. I doubted whether a woman could know machinery the way you said you did. I told myself that letter described whatever a person needed it to say to get out of wherever they were trying to leave. I find I was wrong on every count. Nell looked at him and said, I know you doubted it. I could tell from the way you carried my bag from the stage stop. Garrison said, how does a man carry a bag when he doubts the letter? Nell said, Like he's already planning to carry it back. Garrison said nothing to that. After a moment, Nell said, "The machine was not broken, Mr. Wick. It was making the same sound for 2 years, telling anyone willing to listen exactly which part was failing. The men who tried before me listened with their hands and replaced what their hands found first. I listened with my ears and let the machine tell me where the hands should go afterward. That is not a more complicated method. It is only a slower one, and slower was what it needed." Garrison said, "That is not how I was taught to fix things." Nell said, "No. It is how you learn to fix them when you are not permitted to start by assuming your strength will be enough." She let that rest between them for a moment. The way a person lets something rest when they have said the true thing, and are willing to give the other person time to find their own way to it. Then she said, "I did not come to Dakota to prove something to you, Mr. Wick. I came because the advertisement said capable, and I am, and I hoped you meant it. I am still hoping you meant it." Garrison Wick looked at his wife, standing beside a machine that had beaten 3 men in 2 full seasons, and an amount of money he preferred not to add up standing in the same sentence, and said, "I meant it. I mean it considerably more than I did this morning." The Wilson brothers ran the thresher that same evening, and told anyone who asked that it was the smoothest it had run in any season. They could recall, which was the kind of neighbor testimony, that Garrison Wick would once have slow to credit coming from a woman, and found himself, by the end of that evening, recounting without hesitation to everyone who came by to ask what had happened. What happened in the months that followed was a different kind of accounting from what either of them had planned. Garrison began consulting Nell on equipment purchases before he made them, which was not something he had done with anyone, having been in the habit of deciding such things alone, the way he had been in the habit of deciding everything alone for 15 years. She saved him from 2 purchases that would have been wrong for reasons she identified, without looking superior about it, and suggested one that he would not have considered on his own, which turned out to be the most reliable piece of equipment he owned for the next decade. Neighboring farms began sending for Nell when their own machinery gave trouble. She went when she could, which was often, and fixed what she found with the same patient method, listening first, looking second, touching third. That had resolved the thresher's fault in a single afternoon. Garrison rode along on these calls, not because she needed him there, but because he had developed by then a specific and genuine interest in watching her work. The way you develop an interest in watching anything that reliably produces wonder after a long season of expecting only disappointment. Odell became in the following years a devoted student of Nell's approach. He watched how she listened before she touched, how she let a machine run long enough to show its fault before naming it. And he practiced the method on his own with her occasional correction, until it became his own habit rather than a borrowed one. He told people in later years that the afternoon he watched Nell Ashby fix the thresher was the same afternoon he stopped believing that the first explanation for a fault was necessarily the right one. A change that he said saved him more time and money in the decades that followed than he could usefully calculate. Chadwick Wilson told the story at gatherings for 12 years. He told it the way you tell a story that has settled into something better than an anecdote. Something with a lesson still turning in it, long after you have finished the telling. The thresher itself ran without significant fault for 11 more harvest seasons. Garrison Wick liked to say when anyone asked, that the machine had told 2 mechanics, and a blacksmith and his neighbor's hired hand, exactly what was wrong with it, across 2 full seasons of trying, and that it had taken someone willing to listen before speaking to hear what it was saying. He said it as a statement about the machine. Most people who knew him understood he was saying it about considerably more. Garrison and Nell Wick worked the homestead together for 29 years. Nell fixed a great many things in that time, and she broke her husband's habit of solitary certainty, in roughly the same way she had fixed the thresher, not by force, but by demonstrating steadily and without drama that her judgment was worth consulting, until the consulting became as natural to Garrison as the doubt had once been. Their daughter inherited her mother's ear and her father's patience, which is perhaps the rarest combination a child can receive from 2 people who each came to it by a different and harder road. Garrison Wick's neighbors said, in the years after he was gone, that his greatest accomplishment was not the land he broke, or the wheat he put up, or the winters he outlasted, but the way he had learned in the span of a single September afternoon, to set down a certainty that had cost him 2 years, and 3 men's worth of failed repairs, and to replace it with something that turned out to be worth considerably more than the price of a threshing machine or the words in a letter he had not fully believed when he read it. I have thought about that afternoon a good many times over the years. The thresher was not the story. The thresher was simply where the story could be seen clearly, in the way that the plainest objects sometimes hold the plainest truths in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to stop long enough to look. Garrison Wick spent 2 years waiting for someone to force the fault out of his machine. What fixed it, in the end, was someone who knew the right sound well enough to recognize the wrong one, and who understood that a thing making noise is not asking to be overpowered. It is asking to be heard. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone solve a problem by stopping to listen when everyone else around them kept pushing harder? I would like to hear that story.